I'm delighted to be able to be here today with Dr. Elizabeth Kish. I'm Jim Moore. I'm the founder and the CEO of the Washington Institute. And Dr. Kish is the head of the CEO of the Rhodes Trust, as well as the warden of the Rhodes House at Oxford University. She received her doctorate in philosophy from the University of Oxford back in 1990, which seems like a long time ago, but I'm sure it isn't. And at the same time, she had the opportunity for a number of years to be the 8th president of Agnes Scott College. I'm delighted that she has been essentially the first woman to have ever headed up the Rhodes Scholarship Program. And we're just so pleased to be able to spend some time with her this morning here and the afternoon at Oxford. Anyway, welcome so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. It's amazing. I was saying earlier this morning that I feel as though the world is in an education lab at the moment because so much is happening and it's so serious and so severe on so many levels. And I'm not sure that in our lifetime we've ever gone through this. We have just gone through and are continuing to go through this pandemic. We have just gone through a major geopolitical shift as a result of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. We are experiencing the severity of climate change. We're going through tribalism socially and politically at a time when, unity is so critically important. We fortunately have been seeing some of the vestiges of unity arise as a result of the recent invasion, but it's really a tough time. And for students, they've got to be scratching their heads. We here at the Washington Institute are so committed to working with young people because we're going to be passing on this legacy to them, good, bad, or ugly. And it's really very, very tough. How are you dealing with all that these days on your end?
Sure. No, I mean, as you say, there's so much going on. And I mean, I suppose, my starting point for that is to recognize that it makes the work that we do as educators all the more important. And, as I think about the Rhodes Scholarship in particular, bringing young people from around the world to study together, to learn in community with each other is, more urgent and vital than ever before. The original vision of the Rhodes Scholarship that, our very controversial founder, Cecil John Rhodes, had, actually a really beautiful part of the vision was he thought bringing what he perceived as all these young men from around the world and then sending them back out to protect the values of the British Empire. He thought it would create a more peaceful world. That was one of the values that drove the establishment of the Rhodes Scholarships. And of course, the world has changed a lot. The British Empire is no more. We now have women. We have young people from all over the world. We are no longer imbued with the values of the British Empire in particular. And yet, it does make me think about how we equip young people with the tools. I mean, they will make their own way, right? But how do we equip them with the tools to think deeply and with nuance about these challenges, to build the kind of resilience and that commitment to making the world a better place, to make friendships across lines of difference and think about how they can build community in the face of disagreement, all of these things that are critical to certainly our mission at the Rhodes Scholarships is all the more vital given the challenges that this generation is going to have to tackle. We are all having to tackle, but they are going to really have to envision their lives in the context of all of this challenge and uncertainty and danger.
Yes, indeed. But it seems to me, I had the opportunity to teach at Georgetown in the business school for almost 20 years, and I think of my textbooks that had copyrights several years earlier. And I'm afraid that these days, book learning only goes up to a certain point because we're actually living a brand new kind of history that we've really not we've not seen before. I'm fascinated by what you've been doing recently, where you call it character, service, leadership, and shared scholarship as hallmarks of the kind of work that you're doing. Would you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, sure. So, what's interesting with with the work we do with Rhodes Scholars in particular is that for much of our history, Rhodes Scholars were selected on the basis of certain criteria, including public spiritedness and concern for others and integrity and courage. And then they were basically brought to Oxford and let loose on this, wonderful university. But the trust itself didn't do very much intentionally to bring scholars together or to do programming with them. And so that changed about a decade ago. What we've put in place and continue to tweak and work on is that we bring the cohort together. We have what we call our character service and leadership retreats. We have one with the first year class, which was just this past weekend, and then one with the second year class, and then other opportunities over the course of their time in Oxford. They're all pursuing different degrees and studying different things. Reflect deeply on their own values, on how they're showing up with each other, how they build community, while acknowledging the many different aspirations and kind of life pathways that and really intellectual and other sorts of interests that Rhodes Scholars have. How do they build a community that, as I talked to them this weekend about, for instance, shadow and light. So we talked about how every form of leadership, every kind of every quality and strength that we have as leaders also has a shadow side, and to encourage them to think about what are their strengths, but also what are the ways in which they may be tempted by little things that could then eventually become, whether it's corruption or hubris or all of the various things. And of course, we were all talking this weekend on the terrible invasion of Ukraine and the awful human suffering, and how much of it is actually driven by a particular leader's sort of toxic personality and toxic values. And so we were talking about, how does that start in somebody's life? How do you prevent it? How do you create teams and institutions and structures that create a kind of more kind of safe and humane societies and communities and institutions? So what I like to say about our character service leadership program is that although we do have readings, most of the text is actually the scholars' own lives and their experiences and their values. And what we're trying to create is a space where they can be honest and authentic with each other, and hopefully build those connections of friendship and solidarity and accountability that will, as they go out into the world, help them, lead truly good lives in the future.
Elizabeth, I just love what you just said. And I think your work is probably more important today than it was yesterday. The Washington Institute came into existence because of a deep belief that the problems of the world are so vast and so complex that we can't simply have business or government or society deal with it. They've all got to deal with it. Silos are for farmers, as I like to say, and that this sort of collaboration, this teamwork, this ability of taking leaders that may have a disposition towards one or the other, but they realize they've got to work together to be able to really see that civilization progresses. And I think that is so important. And I think what you're doing is so critically important in this day and age.
Thank you. It's certainly, it's exciting and inspiring, and also, as you well know from your own work, can also be challenging. So
You bet. Absolutely. But I find it very interesting too today, particularly when you're educating young people. We never heard, certainly when I was going to school, things like fake news and false facts and alternative facts. And it's just amazing to me that these sorts of things have ultimately erupted. And I think about your background. Your father was a political prisoner in Nazi Hungary, then in communist Hungary.
yes,
And today we see where Vladimir Putin is talking about the Jewish president and the Jewish prime minister as being Nazis that need to be overtaken. And and people are buying this because they're cut off from being able to understand exactly what the situation is. And so education today is so critically important, but it also concerns me when we see that the people who are being educated are dismissed as simply elites and that we shouldn't be really listening to them because we know what the real truth is. But it's a very confusing time. And to be able to set our future leaders straight and to show the right course, it's so very, very important.
absolutely. And I think, I mean, you've touched on, with alternative facts and fake news. I mean, the ways in which, I think, liberal democratic societies and institutions and structures are being challenged both from within and from without. And so, it's very interesting within our community of scholars, because of course we have, lots of scholars from the US and Canada and Australia, but we also have scholars from China and from Zimbabwe and South Africa and Syria and Lebanon and
Wow.
Israel and and India. I mean, I'm just naming some of our. We are now actually truly global as a scholarship. Ethiopia, we've had a scholar from Ethiopia. So part of what is also, I think, so important with creating those kinds of global learning environments is that we actually have scholars amongst us who have personally experienced some, whether they've experienced the Syrian war or their families experienced the war in the Balkans, or they come from a country like Ethiopia that is in the midst of terrible, terrible strife. And so, there's also a way in which, and I think for everybody, this is true, looking at what's happening in the Ukraine and the incredible courage of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government, but also the incredible courage of these protesters in Russia who have been by the thousands in the face of all this fake news and propaganda out of the Putin government are still standing up and being willing to say, I say no to this war. And just, yesterday there was the incredibly brave woman who stood up on national television in Russia. I mean, and you think, so I think part of what today is we are being really profoundly challenged. And I think for young people, it has a particular resonance, of like, what do I stand for? What am I willing to sacrifice for? And I think the other piece is that, I feared at times in the last few years that given things like the fake news and what happened, some of the things that happened in the United States, the former President Trump's, trying to question the legitimacy of the election that he lost, all of that, that young people would come out of that with a sense of not caring about institutions. Like I'm going to leave all those big institutions behind. I'm going to just cultivate my own garden. I'm going to, I will do grassroots work. I will do, and there is that impulse, I think, in a lot of young people. But I think what's happened more recently has reminded all of us, but I think also reminded them how important it is to invest in the health of our core institutions. It's certainly been very, I mean, given the mission of the Washington Institute, it's been very interesting to see businesses engaging in rather forceful international diplomacy. I mean, actually making decisions, to pull out of Russia, in a way that it's hard to imagine they would have done, even a few years ago. And so thinking about major institutions of a free society, what does it take for them to thrive? What are our obligations? All of those questions, I think, are front and center for the scholars.
And to that point, it is amazing. We are being deluged back here in the United States these days with the photos, the footage, the coverage of journalists who have tears in their eyes talking about what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. You see these incredible buildings that have been destroyed just overnight. And you realize not only for Ukraine, but also for Russia, that with all that has transpired in being able to fend off this invasion, that it is going to take not days or weeks or months, it's going to take years to rebuild lives, to rebuild buildings, to rebuild the global economy that they were so much a part of. It's going to take the kind of leaders that are graduating to be able to go out there and to try to figure this all out and how you get to the next steps.
Absolutely, absolutely. The pictures out of Ukraine have very much evoked for me, although I was born in the United States after my family fled as refugees after the Soviet invasion, which crushed the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. But the images of Budapest after the Second World War and then after 1956, and the bridges destroyed, the buildings destroyed. And you just think about how much work as you say, it has taken, will take to rebuild. And you think about Syria and Chechnya and the Crimea. I mean, just other places that have been subjected to this kind of scorched earth 21st century warfare. It's very sobering.
And it's also amazing that somehow we don't seem to learn from history. Although this is so very different in so many ways, it's a variation on a theme, and it's amazing how there can be power in the hands of one individual who can really make the Geiger counter go in such a dramatic direction, and it's rather extraordinary. And in some ways, this seems even a lighter subject, but it's not. And that is, how have you dealt with this pandemic? I mean, my goodness gracious, it's been more than 100 years since the world went through a pandemic of this nature and this size. And here we've had, COVID. I've been very fortunate in not having it. Everybody around me has had it, and they've not had it once. They've had it twice, and they were vaccinated, and they had their booster shots, and it's really been quite extraordinary. But how does an educator in your position deal with such a very different sort of situation that's been thrust in your lap?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I mean, I'm very proud of what Oxford did and so many other universities, around the world in pivoting to online learning in ways that at least, sustained the opportunity for students to complete degrees, to not to have to just drop out or stop their study. So if you'd said to the typical department or faculty member 6 months before the pandemic, 2 months before the pandemic, you could pivot to online learning in 5 weeks, they would have said, oh, there's absolutely no way that could ever happen. So it certainly showed that necessity was the mother of invention for sure, and innovation. I think for us at the Rhodes Trust, we really focused on how do we continue to do this kind of work around character service and leadership and build community with our scholars, even though at one point, they ended up like going home and then getting stuck at home. So last year's character service leadership retreat occurred virtually in 10 different time zones. So we had to be very creative. My colleagues had to be very creative to figure out when scholars are in New Zealand and Australia, they're not getting out of there anytime soon. And the west coast of Canada and everywhere in between, South Africa, Kenya, etc. And some of them, of course, stuck also in Oxford, but studying in their dorm rooms, not actually going to class. How do you build community? How do you create programming that is, actually engaging? And it was really wonderful to see also how resilient they were, the ways in which the students themselves would, whether it was making, cookies to take to the people who were in hotel quarantine, because we had a lot of people who, if they did come back, they were stuck in hotel quarantine for a while, or just, supporting each other, but also finding ways to see the pandemic as a learning opportunity. So we did these like small virtual dinners where they would get a voucher to buy dinner, to order dinner. But I would ask them, what are you learning about yourself in this time of pandemic? And what are some lessons that you want to carry forward? And maybe even what are some silver linings for you? And the insights that students identified, I'll just mention a few. It was just really, really special, like how if you reflect on what's happening to you, it can really be a part of your journey as a person. So, a couple of scholars I know said things like, it was actually at both extremes. Some who said, I am such an extrovert. And I realized like how much of what feeds me was, being the life of the party. And so I've actually had to find resources within myself to, have joy and well-being, if I'm cut off from the things that have fed me throughout my life. And then at the other extreme, people say, I always thought I was a profound introvert, and I realized I'm not as profoundly introverted as I thought. I do crave, human connection. But also, even things like, it was one of the beautiful things about the pandemic is people discovered nature, and they discovered how green spaces can feed our souls. And, often that was the only place you could even meet somebody is outdoors, So I remember one scholar saying, well, we've all turned into characters in a Jane Austen novel. We are walking through the English countryside, talking about life and the world. So, that was a really special part of the pandemic for us. Was it made us more creative, and it taught us tools that we're now able to use. But also I think any big challenge can, if confronted thoughtfully, can actually shape who we are and make us, better people. And of course, I was also hugely impressed by scholars who, stopped their DPhil research in order to pivot to COVID research or to work with the NHS. So there was some really beautiful examples of that. Or, a couple of scholars who asked me I have this mini grants program, and they said, could we have a mini grant, a Warden's mini grant? Because we want to print personal protective equipment in our dorm room. We want to buy a 3D printer, and they actually did. They created these visors and distributed them to care homes, in Oxfordshire. And I just thought that was such a beautiful response, to here I am stuck in my dorm room. Maybe I can do something.
But one of the sad things though about the pandemic is the incredible questioning of science. My father was a physician, and he went to the University of Pittsburgh Medical School when Jonas Salk was in the process of coming up with a vaccine for polio.
Mm.
And I can remember when I was about 6 or 7 years old, in our local town, which was fairly small, of about 3 or 4 thousand people, he went to the high school to oversee all the people who were giving the vaccine to a number of people. And my mother took my brother and me down to be able to get our vaccine. And when I got my vaccination, my shot, I turned around and there was my mother, and she was absolutely crying.
Mm.
And I looked at her and I said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Because I feel so blessed that you boys will not have to suffer the way we have seen people suffer from polio." My parents had gone through a ward in a very large hospital in Pittsburgh that had the iron lungs, and the sounds and the smells of the iron lungs trying to keep people alive was something that never left her or my father. And now all of a sudden, we have these people who are questioning vaccines. I heard a lawyer literally talking about the fact that the devil was one of the ingredients in the vaccines, and that if you took the vaccine, you were going to have this propensity to be against God. And when you hear things like that, you realize you can't get into a debate with somebody like that, and you just pretty much turn away. But our young people are having to take these experiences, listening to these kinds of wild accusations, and realize that the people like we have on here on this side of the Atlantic. My heart goes out to Dr. Fauci, who has had to deal with this in a very straightforward way, and yet he's questioned every single step of the way. It's amazing.
It is absolutely amazing. And I mean, I think it's one of the, for anybody who's, I mean, I think anybody who looks objectively at what happened through this pandemic, it is an extraordinary success story of science. I mean, to think that, to think that we would have not just one, but multiple effective vaccines developed in such a short period of time, which have saved, hundreds of thousands, if not more, lives, and ever more effective treatments and everything. And then, as you say, people kind of rejecting this. It is. I mean, it's incredibly troubling. I was reading actually that there were some similar things that happened in the flu epidemic or pandemic in the 1918 to
Yes.
the 21. So I mean, so it seems to be somehow, I don't know. I mean, I find myself so deeply puzzled about what is driving this, this suspicion of science. I can understand why sometimes people can be bewildered because, of course, scientists are trying to make decisions and put forth policy recommendations and roll out vaccines in the face of some uncertainty. And if you're going to administer a vaccine to millions of people, there will be side effects. There will be people who have side effects. So I think there were some people who I think were, they were struggling with, they actually wanted the science to be, perfect and, and infallible. And that's not true. If you actually have to understand the scientific method and how scientists work and develop treatments and test and review their findings. But then, as you said, there are the people who seem to, in a way that, of course, endangers lives, and many people have died as a result of this awful kind of propaganda. And like, what drives it? What is it that drives this sort of superstitious fear?
Yes.
Is very, very perplexing. It's very
in,
perplexing.
in the year 2022. But what you said was so true. It is amazing how business and government came together on behalf of society so quickly. And I'm looking at that backdrop of yours with Oxford University, and Oxford was at the forefront of being able
Absolutely.
to be able to do this. It's really rather extraordinary, but we're getting through this, hopefully, notwithstanding the fact that we all thought this was behind us here in the United States, and all of a sudden we're discovering that Barack Obama has COVID. China seems to be closing down again. Vietnam is. So it's not really behind us. And we also have to think about the fact of what comes up with future variants. And we've just
Yes.
heard from the CEO of Pfizer saying, I think that we're going to have to come up with a fourth dose of the vaccine because we're just not out of the woods yet. And it's not just the profit margin that made him say that.
Absolutely. No, and I mean, I have to say, so proud of the Oxford team and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, especially because it is being offered on a not-for-profit basis, an at-cost basis through this.
That's incredible.
Pandemic. And I don't think, frankly, AstraZeneca has they've gotten bad press instead of good press for that,
Yes,
which is deeply troubling. But having heard from the privilege of actually hearing from some of the people who were involved in this effort here in Oxford, they are, their sense is that in the end, history will be the judge, of what was accomplished here.
Yes.
But certainly, I think we can all be so grateful that we live in the present day. I think about that, like if we didn't have the scientific capacity to do what happened, to actually develop effective vaccines and treatments, and also if we didn't have this kind of technology of video conferencing, it would have, this pandemic would have shut down so much of life as we know it. So it certainly it has made me very grateful to live in the era that I do.
You bet.
For all of its challenges that we've been
Absolutely.
discussing.
One of the things I love about your background is that you have been so preoccupied with philosophy and moral philosophy and politics and all, and so that you're able to really kind of see the forest for the trees and to be able to have a better sense of perception and how we have to deal with all this. I'm wondering, for example, how, given all these problems, we haven't even gone into climate change, and that is a very serious problem. That with all these other problems that we have, we can't forget it. And we're suffering terribly here in the United States with so many things that are the result of climate change. But given the young people that you're dealing with now, dealing with when you were president of Agnes Scott, I'm wondering how do you view the young people today being able to carry out and carry on the future for the world? Are you hopeful? Are you concerned? What are your thoughts?
No, I am. Well, I am a congenital optimist. Okay, so I will give that kind of caveat. But I have great hope. We know from history that great generations are forged out of the crucible of difficult times, and I have said that to scholars about, this is your opportunity to step up to these challenges. And I actually this morning spent an hour. We have a little fund that supports climate change related research. It's for Rhodes scholars, but also some other students at Oxford. And we were reviewing the applications this morning and commenting on how much stronger these applications were than the ones we had received even 3-4 years ago for this same research fund. So there's a seriousness of purpose among scholars. There's a lot of focus, certainly within the Rhodes community, and I think among students generally, certainly was true at Agnes Scott, of people being really focused on climate change, recognizing, frankly, that your and my generation has certainly scientists in our generation have identified the problem, but politically, we have been very, very slow on the uptake and it is precisely the kind of problem, the kind of wicked, long-term, profound problem that is very hard for, I would say, democracies to tackle. Very hard for business leaders, if it's your quarterly returns that you're going to be judged on or you're trying to get reelected in 2 years or in 6 years or 4 years. There are a lot of barriers to people actually facing up to and taking the kind of difficult action that needs to be taken on climate change. But looking at these applications and just the range of topics, from green ammonia that could be used as an emissions-free fuel to trying to figure out where climate litigation can best, as a law student looking at climate litigation and where it can best be used to thinking about how to take the very, very dirty heating systems of a place like the UK and leapfrog the technology. So this is an engineering student trying to think about leapfrogging technology to create, much greener heating systems. I mean, that's just 3 out of a wide array of topics. So there's just such commitment to trying to solve, this very, very large and complicated challenge, and it's going to take, as back to something you said earlier, it's something that will take certainly the business sector, government, the NGO sector, activists. There's sort of a division of moral labor here, as I like to say, for us to actually make progress on something like climate change. And it's going to take engineers and lawyers and poets and anthropologists and medics and all of these folks. And I'm especially moved at some of our scholars who come from developing countries and from very, very poor backgrounds, talk with such passion about wanting to make it possible for rural Kenya or Zambia or Zimbabwe, their community, their home village, to get access to electricity, but to do it in a way that is, that's not going to have a toxic impact on the climate. So there's a lot of visionary thinking, that is quite wonderful. And so, yes, I am optimistic, but I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy. It's lots of hard times ahead. And, for a long time, I think, even though we were doing a lot on climate leadership at Agnes Scott, and I remember, saying to people, the impacts of climate change are very close by, but I think it's taken really the last few years for more and more people to recognize they're here and now.
You bet.
Yeah, here and now.
It's amazing. I think the human condition is such that it's difficult for us to think 2 steps ahead. And we're all so concerned with what's happening right now at this very moment. I'm very proud of the fact, for example, as I shared with you earlier, I just returned from Doha, Qatar. And Qatar is a fairly small country, but it is sitting on the world's largest gas field, which is in the water just off the coast. And what they are heavily involved with right now, and we are actually here in the United States, we're teaming up with Princeton University, work with Qatar in what is called net zero. And we're trying to be able to they're trying to figure out how the world can indeed not have the adverse impact of a huge carbon footprint. And some people have said to me, why would Qatar, when it's making all of its money from gas, be concerned about carbon footprints? They should just want to be able to just continue to be able to produce gas and get it out into the market and get the dollars as a result. Well, the fact is that they are thinking 2 steps ahead, 3 steps ahead. that this is not going to last forever and that there's a need to be able to deal with something that is as serious as climate change is.
Yes, absolutely,
Extraordinary.
absolutely. Well, and we've also seen how these things intersect with how parts of Western Europe are so dependent on gas pipelines from Russia, and how confronted with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, in quite remarkable ways. I think a number of Germany and other Western European countries have made kind of tough decisions that are going to impact their populations in the short term. So it's, I mean, there's so much work that needs to be done across every discipline, for us to be able to confront and adapt to and hopefully, as you say, get to net zero. We have a new master's degree actually at Oxford, started by a Rhodes Scholar who teaches at the university, that's on sustainability enterprise and the environment. And so, they're very interested in these kind of market-driven solutions, and kind of how the corporate sector can be a leader in the energy transition. I was speaking recently to someone who works at Liberty Mutual, these large global insurance companies, which of course insure a lot of mines and power plants and all sorts of things, and they're how they're trying to make kind of core to their policy how they support their clients on their own energy transition plan. So, it's not one big solution, it's a million different solutions, and each one takes getting people, to do something that is not going to be the easiest business as usual thing to do. And yet, if we care about our children and grandchildren in the future, we have to tackle it. So,
Absolutely. Listen, I can't get over it, but we're actually at the end of this program. And I'll tell you, I first of all, I just cannot thank you enough. And I think for anybody who has taken the last 45 minutes and listened to it carefully, they realize that you're doing God's work and man and woman's work, and that it's so very, very important. There is nothing, I don't think, that is more imperative today than being able to prepare the young people for what they are to undertake. And you're fortunate to be able to have the creme de la creme of people from all over the world coming together and trying to understand what it is that they are inheriting, because sometimes I don't think we're passing on exactly what I would like to pass on to them. But no matter what happens, they have to take it on. And so we just wish you all the very, very best with your work. We're looking forward to continuing to work with you and so many at Oxford and at Rhodes into the future. So thank you so much.
thank you, Jim. Thanks so much for having me, and all the best to you with your important work at the Washington Institute.
Thanks so very, very much. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.